Before the Caribbean pirates you've heard so much about, before the infamous Blackbeard roamed the seas, there was a woman who ruled the coasts of Ireland with iron determination and fearless leadership. Her name, Grace O'Malley, or Gráinne Ní Mháille in Gaelic, the Pirate Queen of Ireland. Her story isn't just one of piracy and rebellion. It's a tale of a woman navigating a man's world, using both sword and diplomacy to protect her people. Today on History Crossroads, we'll dive deep into the wild and extraordinary life of Grace O'Malley. Buckle in, it's a stormy ride ahead. To understand Grace O'Malley's remarkable life, we have to go back to where it all began, the windswept, rugged shores of County Mayo in Western Ireland. Picture it, jagged cliffs that tower over the Atlantic, with the restless sea crashing below. The air here smells of salt, and the constant howling wind seems to carry the whispers of sailors long gone. It's the 1530s, and Grace O'Malley is born into the O'Malley clan, one of the most powerful seafaring families in Ireland. Her father, Owen Dubhdara O'Malley, commanded a fleet of ships that patrolled the waters of Clew Bay. The O'Malleys weren't just fishermen. They were rulers of the sea, collecting tolls from those passing through their waters and engaging in a healthy mix of piracy and legitimate trade. Young Grace grows up watching her father command ships, negotiate deals, and yes, sometimes plunder rival clans or English merchants. The sea is in her blood. But this is 16th century Ireland, and girls aren't supposed to lead fleets. They're supposed to marry well, stay home, and be quiet. Grace had other plans. Even as a child, she's headstrong. There's a fire in her that can't be dimmed. One day, when her father refuses to let her join him on a sea expedition, Grace takes matters into her own hands. Legend has it she cut off her long hair to disguise herself as a boy and snuck aboard. This act of rebellion earned her the nickname Gráinne Ní Mháille, Bald Gráinne, a name that would stick with her throughout her life. Grace wasn't just rebelling against her father. She was rebelling against the very world she lived in, a world that didn't expect much from women beyond keeping the hearth warm and raising children. But Grace? She was out to prove she could not only sail with the men, she could lead them. Imagine her, just a young girl, standing on the deck of her father's ship for the first time. The sun reflecting off the Atlantic waves, the wind tugging at her short hair, and her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel it in her bones. The sea was where she belonged. As Grace grew older, her ambitions only deepened. And when the time came, she made her first major political move, marriage. At the time, marriage wasn't just about love or companionship, especially for a powerful clan like the O'Malleys. It was about alliances, power, and control of territory. Grace married Donal O'Flaherty, the son of another prominent Irish chieftain, solidifying her family's power and influence over the waters of the West Coast. Donal O'Flaherty was, by most accounts, a warrior. But if we're being honest, he wasn't the sharpest sword in the armory. He had a hot temper, and while he was decent in a fight, he lacked the tactical mind and leadership skills Grace possessed. She quickly proved herself as the real leader, both in battle and on the seas. Donal's clan controlled the coastal region of Connemara, and through him, Grace gained access to more ships, men, and wealth. She used this newfound power to expand her influence, leading raids along the west coast of Ireland and even as far as Scotland. While Donal was off picking fights with rival clans, Grace was plotting strategies, forming alliances, and making sure her ships were well armed and ready for action. In one infamous episode, Donal's hot-headedness led to a feud with the Joyce clan, and the O'Flahertys found themselves besieged in a castle known as Cock's Castle. Donal was outmatched, but Grace, who had by now built a reputation for being as fierce as any man, led a counterattack and successfully defended the castle. From that day forward, the locals referred to it as Hen's Castle in honor of Grace's leadership. But tragedy struck when Donal was killed in an ambush. Most women in Grace's position would have retired quietly, raised their children, and left the business of power to the men. Not Grace. She seized control of Donal's fleet and men, asserting herself as the true leader of the O'Flaherty clan. From that moment on, Grace was the undisputed pirate queen of the west coast of Ireland. Her ships were everywhere, controlling trade routes, collecting tolls, and, when necessary, engaging in outright piracy. Now, you'd think one marriage was enough for Grace, especially after the death of Donal. But no, she had another card to play. Enter Richard Burke, also known as Iron Dick, a chieftain who controlled Rockfleet Castle, a strategic stronghold on Clew Bay. This wasn't a love story. Grace didn't marry Richard out of affection or romance. She married him because he had something she wanted: control over a key portion of the coastline and, more importantly, his castle. The marriage was a brief affair. Legend has it Grace stayed just long enough to get what she wanted. After 1 year, she stood at the gates of Rockfleet Castle and announced to Richard, "I divorce you." That's right, folks. Grace O'Malley pioneered the quickie divorce long before Vegas ever got in on the action. But Grace didn't leave empty-handed. She kept Rockfleet Castle, making it her base of operations for the rest of her life. And with that, she solidified her control over Clew Bay and the surrounding waters. From her stronghold, Grace ruled the seas with an iron grip. Ships passing through her waters had to pay tribute or face the consequences. Pirates today are romanticized as treasure hunters and swashbucklers. But for Grace, piracy wasn't just a profession. It was a means of survival. With the English crown tightening its grip on Ireland, her raids were as much about protecting her people as they were about personal gain. To understand Grace's actions, we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Ireland in the 16th century was a land of conflict. The island was divided into a patchwork of clans, each with its own territory and its own struggles. But looming over them all was the growing power of the English crown. For decades, the English had been trying to bring Ireland under their control, and while they had some success in the east, the west, where Grace and her clan operated, was still fiercely independent. The English governors were determined to subdue the Irish chieftains, and Grace's defiance was a thorn in their side. Sir Richard Bingham, the English governor of Connaught, was particularly ruthless in his efforts to suppress the Irish clans. He viewed Grace as a pirate and a rebel, someone who needed to be crushed. Bingham's tactics were brutal. He executed chieftains, confiscated lands, and imprisoned those who resisted. But Grace wasn't easily cowed. She used her wits and her ships to outmaneuver Bingham's forces. In one famous incident, Grace's fleet ambushed an English supply ship off the coast of Clew Bay, seizing its cargo and sending a clear message: the O'Malleys were still in control of the seas. Grace wasn't just a pirate. She was a leader and a strategist. She understood the importance of both diplomacy and warfare. In fact, she often played both sides, negotiating with English officials when it suited her, but raiding their ships when they pushed too far. Her ships were small but fast, perfectly suited for the rocky coastlines of Ireland. These vessels, known as galleys, were powered by both sails and oars, allowing Grace and her crew to slip in and out of narrow inlets, evading larger, slower English ships. And her men were loyal to her, not because of her status as a chieftain's daughter, but because she had proven time and again that she was as capable, if not more so, than any man on the battlefield. One of her most daring feats occurred when she led a raid on an English-controlled castle, capturing it with only a handful of men. The English garrison inside was completely unprepared for Grace's lightning-quick assault. And once the castle was in her hands, Grace made sure to plunder its supplies and arm her fleet with the captured weapons. As Grace's influence grew, so did the tension with the English crown. Sir Richard Bingham, ever the thorn in Grace's side, eventually captured her and threw her in prison. For many, this would have been the end of the story. But Grace, she wasn't about to give up that easily. Through sheer force of will and some clever diplomacy, Grace managed to secure her release. But Bingham wasn't done with her yet. The two engaged in a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, with Grace continuing her raids and Bingham relentlessly pursuing her. At one point, Bingham even captured her son, Tibbet, as a way to force Grace's hand. But Grace had one last ace up her sleeve. She petitioned Queen Elizabeth I directly for a meeting, hoping to appeal to the one woman who might understand her position. Imagine the scene. London, 1593. Grace O'Malley, now in her 60s but still as fierce as ever, arrives at the court of Queen Elizabeth I. The English court is a world away from the rugged coasts of Ireland. Here, the halls are filled with the finest tapestries, the air thick with the scent of incense and perfumed lords and ladies. Grace, in her practical yet regal Irish garb, stands out like a wild hawk among songbirds. She doesn't bow to Elizabeth. Why would she? Grace O'Malley bows to no one. This is a meeting of equals. Two powerful women who have carved out their own empires in a world dominated by men. They speak in Latin, the only language they both share fluently. Grace makes her case. She demands the release of her son, an end to Bingham's oppression, and the restoration of her clan's rights. Elizabeth listens, perhaps intrigued by this woman who has defied not just the English crown, but societal expectations for her entire life. In the end, Elizabeth agrees to Grace's demands. Tibbet is released, and Bingham is ordered to back off. But there's a catch. Grace must pledge loyalty to the crown. Did she truly mean it? Well, that's up for debate. Grace certainly had her own definition of loyalty. Grace O'Malley's story didn't end with her final years at sea. After her death, her legend only grew. She became a symbol of Irish resistance, of defiance against colonial rule, and of the power of women to shape their own destinies. In Irish folklore, she is remembered as a fierce warrior and a cunning leader, her name spoken with the same reverence as the great chieftains of old. But she is also seen as a feminist icon, a woman who lived life on her own terms, long before women's rights were even a concept. Her castles still stand today, silent witnesses to her reign as the Pirate Queen, and her story continues to inspire, not just in Ireland, but around the world. In a way, Grace O'Malley's life was like the sea she loved so much. Wild, unpredictable, and full of untold depths, Grace O'Malley was more than just a pirate. She was a leader, a mother, a politician, and a warrior. She stood up to kings and queens, commanded men, and sailed the stormy seas of both Ireland and English politics with unparalleled skill. Her story is a reminder that history is filled with figures who defied the odds, who broke the mold, and who lived life on their own terms. Grace O'Malley was one such figure, a woman who refused to be defined by the limitations of her time. So the next time you hear about pirates, think not of swashbuckling men with parrots on their shoulders. Think of Grace O'Malley, the Pirate Queen of Ireland, who carved her name into history with a sword in one hand and a ship's helm in the other.